Well, greetings, everybody. Welcome to the Safe Passage for Children webinar. This, I just want to mention that usually at this point in the webinar, I tell you what is going to be the next one coming up in 2 weeks, but this is the last one of the season. So this is sort of like your favorite television show. The next time you see the next episode, it'll be September. But so I want to thank all of you who have, joined us over the past year, and we'll line up, some new and exciting webinars in the fall. So I also want to say that we welcome you turning on your cameras if you'd like, because we like to see you, but don't feel pressured to do that if you'd rather not. So with that, let me just do an introduction of our guest today, Daniel Hatcher, who is going to talk about maximizing revenue for children rather than for the counties in the state. I need to give you a little bit of background in this, a little more than I usually do, because we have been working on a bill this year to do the things that we will be talking about. I'll be interviewing Daniel, and he'll be telling you all about it. But some of you have followed this bill, and so I just wanted to share where we are at in the session. This bill got agreement from the counties, the Department of Human Resources, both the House and the Senate and the administration, but it is stuck in that omnibus bill that will require a special session to get passed. And the latest information we have is that everybody had agreed to do this special session and get this bill finally through. Then the new Republican nominee for governor has decided he's going to try to persuade his folks not to support it. So now we're in a little bit of an uncertain situation. But in general, the hard work has been done of getting everybody on board, both legislators in the House and Senate, as well as Department of Human Services and the Association of Counties and the other stakeholders. So worst case is I think that we come back in January and we get this bill through. And what the bill is just to do the planning for a process to have revenues that belong to foster kids be put into trust funds. We'll talk more about the mechanics of that. And then the next year we'll have to come back and actually get the funding for it. So with that, that's the kind of thing that Daniel Hatcher is going to be talking about. So let me introduce him. Daniel helped to pass a bill of the type that I'm talking about in Maryland. I think it was the first of its kind among states, but Daniel, you'll have to make sure.
That's right.
Okay. Has been providing us with technical assistance to do the same here in Minnesota, and I believe in other states as well. Dan is a professor of law at the University of Baltimore School of Law. He teaches at the Civil Advocacy Clinic, and hopefully you can tell us a little bit about that. And before that, he worked at the Maryland Legal Aid Bureau as Assistant Director of Advocacy and as a Senior Staff Attorney with the Children's Defense Fund. I want to put in a little plug for his book. It's especially interesting to people like me who've actually been in this business. It's called Poverty Industry: The Exploitation of America's Most Vulnerable Citizens, and it exposes how state agencies and companies are using vulnerable populations to maximize revenue rather than serving their best interests. So it built on his past scholarship addressing this core conflict between human service agencies and government institutions and some of their clients. So with that, this is going to be, the format is going to be an interview, and this will also be turned into a podcast, which you can listen to as well later as you want. So with that, Dan, can you just, I'd like to say, tell us a little bit more about yourself. How did you get involved with this issue? Tell us as much as you want about your experience with legal aid and Children's Defense Fund, just to give us a little idea of who you are and what you've worked on.
Sure. Well, thank you for this opportunity, and thank you to everybody for joining. It's, still feels like such a dark day with what's happening nationally. Just happened in Texas and just recently in Buffalo with a horrific shooting. So it feels somewhat therapeutic, at least, to be having a conversation with you all to consider how we can try to do our part to improve things. We have to keep trying. I became involved in, I guess, public interest law a long time ago. I graduated law school in 96. I went to law school thinking I wanted to do social justice work. Wasn't quite sure at that point what that really meant, right? You know, I was fairly naive about the systems and how they worked. My first legal aid job out of law school was in Baltimore, and I was representing youth in the foster care system of Baltimore City. And it was an overwhelming experience for me because, well, multiple reasons. The system felt almost purposely broken. The children were being harmed by many of those who were supposed to be helping them. I worried often I was part of that system that was causing more harm than good, right? You know, because although I was the counsel for the children, I think in my first day in court, I represented over 10 children in one afternoon. I represented probably close to 300 children within a year. So with that kind of caseload, when you're a lawyer for youth in the system, you don't have the opportunity to provide what zealous advocacy should be. But through that, I started to encounter these systemic problems that were impacting youth, not just the individual circumstances that they were going through, struggling through difficulties with their families, trying to overcome barriers to poverty, trying to overcome problems once they're in the system, trying to be reunified, issue after issue that was impacting these youth, but then the problems with the systems themselves, right? And I started to see examples where agencies that that exist to serve also seek to exist, where they were serving their own interests rather than their interests of those that they serve. I also started doing some work when I was at legal aid for low-income, non-custodial parents and child support and barriers to employment. And that was eye-opening to me because I had done work before that with legal aid general practice, where most of the family law and child support work I had done was for the custodial parents. So to represent someone who was the absent parent, often with a criminal record, those were the individuals I was often litigating against, right? And it's very easy for society to label the deadbeat dad, as the enemy to be pursued and as the cure for poverty. And that's just simply false. So it was eye-opening for me to experience that and the complications of which child support contributes to the harm. Much of child support people don't realize is actually not even owed to the children because of welfare cost recovery and foster care cost recovery. We can talk about that more. I spent some time at the Children's Defense Fund as a senior staff attorney there, doing legislative advocacy and testified before Congress a couple times. I transitioned to academia and teaching this clinic that I teach now in 2004. So I still am representing low-income individuals, often through my students, right? I'm a supervisor and co-counsel with the clinic student attorneys. And we do a wide variety of what we call poverty law, representing individuals in public benefits and housing, family law matters, you name it, anything that impacts an individual who is poor, which unfortunately are a lot of issues. So it keeps us busy, and I'm constantly learning with my students. It also gave me the opportunity to write once I transitioned to academia, and I love that chance to write about the failings that I've encountered and to dig in and unpack them and try to expose system failings. And I'm driven by what I've seen over the years, and I guess I feel like once I'm aware of a failing, I can't stop trying to do something about it. Even though it's a long fight, but we have to keep trying.
So on that point, so you took a broad view of what you call the poverty industry. So before we jump into the specifics about the Maryland law that you helped to get passed, and I definitely want to get to that, tell us about what is the poverty industry? What are you talking about when you use that term?
Well, it's it's not your traditional industry, which you usually think about, such as you can imagine the coal mining industry, right? Something to that effect, that is mining a good for revenue or profit. With the poverty industry, it's those private companies are certainly involved. Sometimes the same private companies that have been involved in the military industrial complex are also now making millions from poverty programs, but they're aligning with often the state agencies, sometimes the federal agencies, right, as part of that industry. So it's more concerning, almost more concerning to me with that alignment is when the government actors who have a mission to maximize the well-being of their citizens, right? That's the purpose of government. And an agency, that purpose is to maximize the best interests of their beneficiaries. If it's a foster care agency, it's of the foster care youth, right? If it's a Medicaid agency, it's of the recipients of Medicaid, right? But when those agencies get pulled into this poverty industries, they start thinking more and more about revenue and their own fiscal self-interest, aligning with the private actors, right? And then those who they serve are instead becoming a resource to serve them, right? They're literally mining children for resources, how much money they can get from the children rather than serving their best interests.
So tell us, I mean, I think the immediate case we're talking about is the Maryland law that you helped to get passed, and what we're trying to do as well here to preserve income for fosters, as they're called here, anyone in or who has been in foster care, to preserve their income rather than it going to the county or the state. So tell us how that works. That's an example of the poverty industry, right?
Right. Well, and this is one of the earlier issues I encountered, and it's a striking example, I think, of the poverty industry because it's also symbolic, right? You know, of the agencies that have probably one of the starkest missions, most important missions, is to serve vulnerable youth who are experiencing abuse or neglect, right? It's their child welfare agencies, if they are doing their jobs correctly, right? I have a lot of concern where children are pulled into the system too soon rather than services provided to the parents who need them, but that's a broad discussion. But the agencies, if they're true to their mission, they serve some of the most vulnerable among us, right? And they have found a way across the country that children can come with resources, right? Or they may have yet untapped resources. So the agencies figured out that foster youth might be eligible for their own disability benefits, SSI benefits, or they might be eligible for survivor benefits if they have a parent who worked, paid into the Social Security system and died, right? So they're literally targeting children who are disabled or have dead parents, right? Then applying for these benefits on their behalf, often across the country, not telling the children or the advocates that they're doing this, and then they take the money to reimburse state costs, right, rather than using it for the children's best interest. So the argument from these state agencies is they're saying, well, this is expensive to provide foster care, and it is, right? But foster children are not supposed to have to pay for their own care, right? Morally, ethically, or legally. You know, this is an obligation for the states to provide for the cost of that care. So through the practice, they're mining children. I've seen contract documents around the country where sometimes it's a state level agency, sometimes it's city. They contract with some of these companies like Maximus Public Consulting Group and the like. There was a contract document I received in Maryland after a state FOIA, a public records request that I put out, that Maximus described the foster children as a revenue generating mechanism, right? So that's not a good thing, right? You know, so, you know, you can seek more revenue. You know, I think seeking the Social Security benefits is important, right? And helpful if that money is used right. But then if you're using the children as an avenue to seek this revenue and then taking it from them, right? It's just like mining, it's back to the coal mining example. You're pulling them into the system and you're mining revenue from them.
So it took me a while to get my brain wrapped around this, but there's really two main groups, right, of children who have some form of revenue, the SSIs you mentioned, and then the benefits they get because their parents paid into Social Security. And then there's loose ends, railroad retirement, black lung disease, other things that children may have income from.
Veterans assistance benefits, right?
I don't know if it's possible to do this, you know, in a relatively simple way that doesn't take an hour, you know, in itself. But what are these two major sources of revenue that should be going to the foster kids?
Well, they're both through the broader Social Security program. Starting with survivor benefits is probably what most people are familiar with. And we all, if we're working and paying payroll taxes, paying into the system, if we become disabled or if we die, right, our dependents can get either survivor benefits or disability benefits through us, right? So it's much like a life insurance type of benefit. You worked, you paid into the system, similar to your retirement benefit that you get when you retire through Social Security. And it's the dependent benefit, right? The survivor benefit is belongs to the child, right? Because their parent worked and paid into the system. So it's a property right, and they're entitled to it. SSI benefit is also through the Social Security program. It's aimed to help those children who they themselves are disabled, to provide additional income for those children, right? It's a supplemental security income. It's the acronym is SSI. So it's a little more complex with SSI because it's a means tested benefit. The individuals who are eligible have to be low income, and there's also asset limitations on that as well. And it's harder to often for individuals to become eligible for SSI, whether you're a child or you're an adult, because you have to meet the income eligibility, and you also have to meet the disability standard. So what I've seen with some of these contracts with children is they'll contract to take over that process, right, and apply for the SSI benefits, handle the appeals, get all the medical records, right, to try to have those children determined disabled, not though to provide them with more services for their disabling conditions, but to take their money, right? So it's good to have the disabilities determined, right, to have them assessed and realized so they can potentially be served for those disabling conditions. But that's not what's happening when the agencies are doing this. It's a revenue source.
So tell us how you got the bill passed in Maryland. I know from what we've been doing the past year that it's not a simple process. So how did that go? And, you know, who did you work with? And
sure.
Sorry
to interrupt. It was a long process in Maryland. It took us, it was either 5 or 6 years. I can't remember. So I hope it's shorter. And Minnesota, and I'm been impressed with how much progress y'all have already made. In part, this was the first state to do this, so it was new. You know, sometimes state legislatures are wary of doing something that no one else has done before. So it took some education over the first 3 years. I worked with Jamie Raskin, who's now a member of Congress, who then was a state senator on the initial bill. And then Delegate David Moon also became a sponsor from the House side in Maryland, including when the legislation was finally passed some years ago. And Maryland's bill, I think, is a success, but it's a partial success in that it doesn't protect all of the children's Social Security benefit resources. It only starts at age 14. It starts by protecting a percentage of those benefits, and then 40% and increases to 100% by age 18. I very much think Maryland should stop taking any of the benefits from children in their care, and I hope Maryland revisits this and the General Assembly in Maryland. But I am also glad that at least there was some positive movement through this legislation, and even through that partial success, as of 2020, some of the data that we've seen, almost $1 million was conserved in just that 1 year of 2020 for children who have benefited from the practice. So you never know which of those youth, you know, that money can have a life-changing impact at that point where you're trying to transition out of foster care. If you have that additional help, both the monetary help and what I've often thought with survivor benefits, right? If that child knows that they're getting not just this money, but this benefit that was left from their parent who's now deceased, they know their parent worked, paid into the system. They now can use what their parent left them to help themselves. So that benefit is invaluable beyond the money in terms of how it might be able to help a child turn things around.
So was it harder to persuade people to conserve the SSI money, which is kind of a welfare benefit, many people would think of it, than the Social Security money, which somebody paid into, and that, you know, was more clearly, you know, something that they're entitled to? Was that hard to get over that hump?
It wasn't harder to convince them of the ethics of why this should be protected for the children, because it's their money. It's supposed to be protecting them. It's not supposed to be for the agency representative payee. But the challenge was more of the almost the mechanics, the legal complications around SSI are a little harder because you have an asset cap of $2,000. So when the money is conserved, the representative payee needs to make sure they're doing their job and using those funds for other needs that aren't provided by the agency. right, that are exempt from the asset limit. A car is exempt from the asset limit. So if you're a 17-year-old in the system, you could be using your old SSI benefits, right, to purchase a car or to start purchasing a car to make the payments, right, which is a huge need for someone who's transitioning out onto their own. Also, there are various forms of savings accounts that are exempt from that asset limit, including special needs trusts. Social Security itself has something called a program for achieving self-support, and 529A ABLE accounts. So it gets a little complex, but it's still very doable. I've always argued that's exactly why a representative payee exists. And, if I back up a little bit, that's how the agencies are getting access to this money. So when they apply for the benefits on the children's behalf, they also apply to take on this role as a representative payee, right? It's a fiduciary relationship. It's like the representative of an estate, right? After someone has died and they don't represent themselves, they're not supposed to. They're not supposed to take actions for themselves. They're supposed to serve the best interests of the beneficiaries, or if it's for a deceased individual, the estate, right? In this case, the representative payee is solely supposed to take actions in the best interest of that individual child. But instead, they apply for the benefits, they apply to become the representative payee, take on that fiduciary role, don't even notify the children that they're applying for the benefits on their behalf, and then take the money from them without telling them about it to reimburse themselves, right? And self-dealing, self-reimbursement is probably the biggest conflict with fiduciary obligation. I've long thought there are strong litigation actions that could be brought against state agencies that are engaged in this practice based upon that breach of fiduciary obligation, both under federal law, acting as a representative payee, and under state law, acting as the guardian for youth in their care. So the representative payee, they are fiduciaries twice. The foster care agencies exist to serve the best interests of children. They don't exist to serve themselves, right? But too often they've forgotten that in these revenue maximization strategies.
So you came up with a different solution in Maryland, right? There's a different representative payee that is more independent in operating the children's best interest. Can you share how that works?
Well, Maryland, it's still usually the state agency who applies to become the representative payee. That the hope is there's also now Maryland has to give notice. In that the agencies are supposed to give better notice in that process of applying to become the representative payee. So if somebody else is available, the advocate for the child could put them forward, or that individual or that organization themselves could also apply to become representative payee. So there is more flexibility and hope that others will also become the payee. But so far in Maryland, it's been the agency. And what the law does is tell them, agency, you can no longer take the child's money to reimburse yourself, right? Starting at the age of 14. They're still doing it at 14 and younger, right? So they're still taking millions from children in their care.
Well, I had read something in the materials about Maryland that there are a couple of nonprofits that they contracted with who fill that role. They set up the legal piece, they communicate.
The special needs trust, that's
Yes.
right. But not actually acting as a representative payee, but to manage the savings accounts in Maryland, right? They have helped with that. That's right.
So here in Minnesota, the discussion has been around, okay, the same thing. If the counties, and here it's a county system, as you know, the counties become the representative payees, and they're told that they have to conserve the money for fosters, that's fine. But there's this whole process of, kind of setting up some legal structure and
the accounts.
Money, yeah. That's complicated business. We have a lot of small counties here. Even the big counties of the state would have trouble doing that. So,
well, I mean, it takes some effort, but people have been setting up special needs trusts for decades. They've been used for Medicaid for a long time, so they're not really complicated to set up. They just got to do it, right? Yeah. And that's their job. They're supposed to do stuff for kids in their care, right? Even if it's hard, and it's always supposed to be about what's best for the kids.
So how many kids are we talking about here? What's the size of the group?
Oh, well, it varies state by state. And I've seen contract documents in Maryland, when they were initially seeking contracts to help maximizing the Social Security benefits for foster youth. It was maybe even 4% or less of the population. The contract documents were targeting upwards to 20%. So if you look across the country, state by state, county by county, it varies how many children are currently eligible for either survivor benefits or SSI benefits, right? And it also, I think, will vary on what they might target to increase that percentage to. And it's concerning, I'd see these documents and they, I've mentioned the one that referred to foster children as revenue generating mechanisms. They use algorithms, they use data mining. When they're going after the money for the agency to take it, they help, some of the contract documents talk about how they will help the agencies rank the children to determine who to apply for the benefits first, not based on who has the biggest needs, but with who bring in the most money, right? And that's who they go after first. So it's disturbing, like where, again, it flips the whole role on its head of what they're supposed to be doing.
Right. So, and people may not be, if you're not in the business, you're not familiar, but Maximus is this big consulting group that does this kind of work and other, similar work. They're one of the big contractors that states use for a lot of things, including this. But the way you say,
and the federal government uses in other countries contract with them as well. They're big.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we estimated 8% in Minnesota would be a number to work with in terms of fosters who are eligible for this. We won't know until we get deeper into it. But one of the concerns that came up was, okay, what happens if the children go home or get adopted? Do the bio parents then get access to all that money? And then if they go into foster care down the road, then the kids don't have it when they age out?
Well, if it's a special needs trust, it would stay in the special needs trust. But if the and that's probably one of the benefits of special needs trusts is they're a little harder to get the money out of the special needs trust than some of the other accounts, right? But what happens if the child leaves care and either is reunified with their parents or is placed in is adopted or is a relative placement, different types of alternatives that might happen, the representative payee should shift again, right? The agency then should have to stop becoming the representative payee, stop being the representative payee through the Social Security Administration, and it should shift over to a different individual, potentially that parent or family member or adoptive parent, right, depending on who it is. And then that individual or organization, an organization can be a representative payee, takes on that fiduciary role, right? So anytime you have a fiduciary role, you can have people violating that fiduciary role, right? But there are laws to protect that, both under the Social Security Act and at the administrative level, and lawsuits can be brought in court if there's misuse. The problem is right now, like it's pretty straight. Like as an example, I saw there was a story out of New York, Westchester County, if I remember the name of the county right, where they found that a former social worker had embezzled the survivor benefits from a child who was in a bank account after the adoptive parent died of cancer, right? And it was viewed as horrific, right? And the prosecutors at the state level and at the county level teamed up and all went after the social worker, and criminal charges were brought, jail time, right? But that same county has had contracts with some of these private providers to maximize the survivor benefits and other Social Security benefits, take them from the children without telling the children, doing the same thing that social worker done, and they haven't faced any criminal liability. I think they should be criminally liable. And the action that I brought in Maryland initially, one of the claims was conversion, which is the civil equivalence of theft, right? I think that's what they're doing.
So it seems like that the representative payees have kind of a built-in conflict of interest, or in the case of counties, a perverse incentive not to get the child, the benefits that they do, because they have to go through all the work, but then they no longer get the revenue. In fact, early on,
bribery works, right? That's the unfortunate, shouldn't be. That's again, like they're supposed to do this because this is their mission. You shouldn't have to bribe them to do it, but
right.
But yes,
so, I'm guessing that what we're going to, there's going to be a long set of meetings to discuss the nuts and bolts in this. And one of the things I think we'll advocate for is some ongoing way to measure which kids should be considered or should be, put in the process to, so they become eligible for revenue, so that counties don't just do it. In fact, early on in the negotiations, one of the county leaders said, well, if you do this, we'll just stop giving kids, on SSI. And everybody's jaw dropped, and And then they quickly realized, no, that's not going to sound very good. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's them threatening to not do their job. Right.
right. But in a funny way, what it helped us get over a hump, because everybody said, well, that's not right, and it got us to a different point, everybody, including.
It puts it on the table, right? It makes them realize that, because it is practical, if they can no longer take the money from kids and no longer financially incentivized in this conflict of interest way, but you have to deal with that head on. So I'm glad you had that discussion.
Yeah. Not only conflict of interest of not getting the money, but a conflict of interest of having to do work that they don't get the benefit from. So that's where the bill will have, at least it'll make them whole, is the plan. So that whatever revenue they lose from this, the state will replace it. Well, how about an example, maybe from the literature or something that directly? What would be an example of a kid who, didn't get income and how it affected them?
Well, one of the early examples that I encountered when I was I first wrote a law review article, legal journal article about this I started it in 2004. It was published in 2006, and once it was about ready to come out, I started contacting members of the press because I thought they might be interested, and I was connected with this person at the New York Times, Eric Heckholm. And we found an example in North Carolina and a local story in North Carolina, out of Greensboro, North Carolina. It's now called the John G. case. It went up on appeal there, and he was in foster care. He had a stepfather who passed away. That stepfather left to him a Habitat for Humanity house. Right. And it had a small mortgage. I think it was about $250, $220 a month. Right. It was the only thing that had to be paid on that mortgage. So this was, the rare foster youth who was, when he was going to age out of the system, he would have a home, right? His own home. And the agency was refusing to let him use his own survivor benefits to pay his small mortgage so he could have a home when he aged out of care. Right. And luckily the court required them to use that part of the money to pay for the mortgage. But, there are countless youth where things like that are happening. I filed a lawsuit on behalf of a former foster youth in Baltimore who never saw a dime of any of his benefits. And he was pushed from, placement to group homes. He was at one point going to be potentially reunified with a father who had not been in the picture, and his dad died, right? And then he was going to be hopefully reunified with an older brother, significantly older brother, and his brother died. So everybody in his family was dying, and he's being just, placed around the system, place to place, and never getting the services that he needs. And meanwhile, they're taking all his survivor benefits from when his mom had died initially. That's why he was initially placed in foster care, and he aged out of the system penniless and struggled ever since.
Well, and I just want to acknowledge before I forget, should have done this earlier, but the agency that's taken the lead on this legislation is Foster Advocates. And so they've been taking the lead, and we've been doing, in a support role, doing some of the research, that sort of thing. And and it was.
I'm impressed with them and their leadership, and I love the fact that they have former foster youth at the helm of the organization. That's wonderful.
Yeah, and I think the significant thing about that is that we're being told that with all the process they have to go through, 2025 is the earliest that anybody might actually see some of their money. So, we're going to work on that, obviously, and try to speed it up. But he's got fosters who are on his board right now. We actually need the money like this month, and it's terribly frustrating for them. And then I wanted to go back to and say, give a shout out to journalists, because the way that this got off the dime in Minnesota, at least, and I want to see, what other states it might be, but it got off the dime in Minnesota because it was then called the Marshall Project, and then I think then it moved to ProPublica, but and NPR.
Marshall and NPR, yeah.
Yeah, Marshall and NPR did a story on this, including a story about a kid in Alaska who had survivor's benefits and never knew about them, and didn't have the money, didn't have any money.
That's right.
Other kids. So this really got started this, way early this year because of that story.
Right. No, journalism is really helpful on this, and it's been. There's been some stories again, going back to, I was able to work with this journalist at the New York Times, and it was a front page story in the New York Times that ran in, it was either in 2006 or 2007 on this issue. And as soon as that ran, I got a call from Pete Stark's office, a former congressman out in California, said, what can we do about it? So I started working on a federal bill. And that was introduced twice from his office. And then Representative Danny Davis out of Illinois reintroduced it a couple times. And he is hopefully going to reintroduce a bill again. We're hoping this year sometime. And the journalism helps. And there's been a series of other stories about this issue, but you can never expose the issue enough. Awareness brings change. So we have to keep telling the story over and over again.
So is there a chance that there'd be like a national solution for this? If that bill passed, that all the states would have to do the same thing?
There is a chance if it is introduced and if it moves, right? It would have to be actually receive a vote in committee, and that's a challenge these days with everything that's going on. Again, it was introduced 4 times before and never got a committee vote. That's the one benefit, of when you're doing it at the state or even sometimes the city or county level, is you're more likely, in those various local legislatures where there's going to be an up or down vote, at least in the committee, often, unless the committee chair blocks it from going forward, or you run out of time, like what's happening in Minnesota, right? That can sometimes happen.
So,
but it's more possible. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, and maybe it was your question, but I'm thrilled to see that there's been momentum in the states and cities, right? In addition to Minnesota, we're thrilled that you all have been moving forward to this, and I've been impressed with your all's quick level of gaining expertise on the issue and then putting together legislation and to navigate the complications of trying to move it forward. Other states that have looked at it have already had bills. Illinois, the District of Columbia is likely introducing an ordinance very soon at the city level. Philadelphia is introducing an ordinance at the city level. I'm trying to think of the other jurisdictions. Texas has introduced a bill. Connecticut has talked about it. Massachusetts, Hawaii has talked about it maybe for next year. And I know there's others
well, Nebraska, I think
Nebraska has a bill, and Nebraska was very minimal in what they've done so far, but hopefully they'll go further. And one county, I think out of I think Los Angeles, if I remember right, in California, the county level, they're at least asking for more data on this. So and almost by the day, we're getting more and more contacts for folks who want to try to do things. I had a long conversation with advocates in Washington State, including many agency officials in Washington State who are thinking about moving forward, either the agency fixing the issue on their own, right, or through legislation. And then New York City, the agency has taken, the city level has taken the step on their own to stop taking the children's survivor benefits, at least. It's unclear whether they're also going to protect the SSI disability benefits, but that's a big step in the right direction in New York as well. And that was the agency doing the right thing on their own, right, without having to have legislation move it forward.
Yeah, well, that's good. Well, let's see. Hopefully next year at this time, we'll be working on the bill to actually fund this, make the counties whole, and we'll have, between now and then, work out a detailed plan so the legislature knows how to work. So we'll see. We'll obviously you, and also there's another person who's helped us that you've worked with, Amy Harfeld.
Yeah. She and I have been working on this issue for a long time, since the early 2000s.
Yeah. Well, let me, open it up and see, first of all, if there's any other things you want to add, Dan, and then open it up to any questions that people might have, and take it from there.
Sure. Well, I can just give another example, and then I'd love to have any questions people have, or we can just, have an ongoing conversation. This is just one of the examples of these poverty industry revenue schemes that are happening across the country. I think it's a stark example, and it's symbolic as well, because you have the Child Welfare Agency where their sole mission is to serve the welfare of children in their care who are taking money from them, right? How could that be anything more opposite to their mission than what they're doing in this practice, right? But it's happening in other ways as well. Medicaid is often pursued and maximized, right? And again, like the practice of maximizing the benefit isn't in itself a bad thing, but if it's done in a false way, and then if it's diverted to non-Medicaid purposes, that's where the harm results. In New Jersey, the state for years now has been requiring school districts to maximize the number of children who are eligible for school-based Medicaid, right? And that's a need for low-income disabled school children. But then over 80% of those school-based Medicaid revenues are diverted from the schools who are supposed to be providing those services to the children to the state's general coffers, right? So too many states and counties are using Medicaid as a revenue source for the general coffers rather than intended purposes. Nursing homes are used for these kind of revenue schemes all the time. And I mean, the care for our elderly in nursing homes in this country is criminal, right? You know, state by state, even in some of the states where it's considered some of the best care is just often horrific, you know, like, and so that's something that we need to address head on. And instead of making sure that they're getting the service that they need, they're viewed as a source of revenue by the private companies and by the counties and the state agencies themselves, right? So there's a lot that we need to fix.
Well, and I had one other follow-up question, but let me see if anybody else wants to jump in first. And you can either just, you know, you can just unmute and ask the question, or you can put it in the chat box, however you want to do it.
I just want to clarify one point to make sure I understand what you're saying. And I'm looking at a very narrow focus. I'm looking at only the decision-making made by the child protection system. Talk about the child protection workers, county attorney's office, juvenile court judges who are involved in decision-making for the replacement of children into foster care, as well as the decision-making for the children leaving foster care. Are you saying that those people are making their decisions not based on the need for the child to be in a safe environment, but are rather targeting children that they know have financial benefit to the county? And so that children are being removed from homes that they are safe in for financial reasons, and that children are being kept in foster care that could be safely returned home for financial reasons?
It's a great question. I haven't seen direct evidence to show that like at the CPS point, right, of investigation, that they've pulled a child into care, right, so they can take their money, right? But I will say the incentives are there, and it's not just SSI. The 4E structure, the biggest funding stream for the child welfare system is Title 4E of the Social Security Act, and Title 4E is only available if a child comes from a poor family. So what happens is it causes a targeting more towards impoverished families, and in many jurisdictions it has a disproportionate impact based upon race. Dorothy Roberts has written excellent pieces about this. Her initial book, The Color of Child Welfare, which is Shattered Bonds, and she has a new book out called Torn Apart, where she skillfully talks about the systemic racism in the child welfare system. So the incentives are there, right? And then once a child is in the system, the child often gets lost in this system where the social workers are overworked. I think usually the frontline social worker have little knowledge about these revenue streams that are happening kind of behind the system. It's usually happening at the higher up level of the agency or the Department of Revenue for the agency, sometimes directly out of the state Department of Revenue rather than the agency themselves. The Medicaid scheme I talked about in New Jersey, the school-based Medicaid revenue maximization scheme, that program is housed in the state's Department of Revenue, right, which tells you something about what their motives are. So once those incentives are there, it's what happens is you have less focus on the mission, which should be reunification in appropriate cases, right, and the best interest of the child, and instead on the money, right? So it can cause that kind of effect, even if there isn't direct evidence that I've seen so far to say that they pulled the child because that child comes with money along with them.
Yeah, and
the reason I'm asking that question is I spent 40 years working in the child protection system.
Yeah.
And when we, either as a worker or as a supervisor, or as a middle manager, when our staff went out to do assessments on a child's safety in a home environment, we had absolutely no knowledge if they were SSIS eligible, if they're Social Security benefit eligible, if they were 4E eligible. That had absolutely zero part of the equation in assessing if the child was safe in their home environment or not. And if we had gone into the county attorney's office, or the county attorney had filed a petition in the juvenile court and presented it to the judge, we want to place this child because we can get money out of this placement, the judge would have kicked us out of the court in a nanosecond.
I think what you're describing is probably usually accurate around most jurisdictions, where the frontline workers, right, often don't know the sources of funds that are happening behind the scenes, right? But what gets concerning is as soon as that child is pulled into the system, right, then the mechanism starts, right? In Georgia, they're immediately referred to a Rev Max unit, right? That's literally what it's called, right? And they're screened for every source of revenue that they come from. So then at that point, the decisions happen in court. Does that child, enter a shelter? Is the child stay in the system? Is the child assessed to be in Maryland? It was called a child in need of assistance. I'm not sure what the term is in Minnesota. But then, while those legal determinations are made behind the system, right? Not the frontline social workers, but the moneyed offices behind them, they're generating funds. They're looking how they can get money out of the kids, right? And they then often are driving policy, which drives the structure and the policy of the frontline workers, right? Including staffing decisions, in terms of how, what kind of caseload caseworkers have, right? When they have these types of cases. And we could talk for a long time about there. I know in some jurisdictions, in Florida, some of the CPS work has been contracted out to the sheriff's office, and I have a lot of concerns with that. But that's sort of a different discussion.
I would reinforce that in the sense, and Greg, I've done this work at both levels, and I've supervised child protection units, but I've also managed a state revenue maximization project. So I know, and this is not on individual social workers. I mean, it's a rare social worker would even know any of this is happening, really. So there's no perverse incentive for the social worker to make decisions based on the revenue streams. But as Daniel says, once they get in the system, there are people in the management end of the business and the financial end who are checking those things out. So, so I don't think
I don't mean to interrupt, but on the legal side too, I've seen examples in my more recent research of even on the court systems who are financially incentivized, right? Where the courts themselves can sometimes receive the 4E funds based on the more children that are pulled into care. And if a child is removed from their home, the courts are able to actually seek 4E funds, right? So the conflict is there in the financial structure.
Right, but I would push back a little in the sense that I don't think that anybody who's making decisions about whether to remove kids or put them back home and so forth has got a clue about any of this. The revenue max, whether it's Title 4E or this SSI, is really happening someplace where they're just not connected to that discussion.
Well, I don't want to bog down the discussion because other people may have other questions. But all I would suggest is that be very careful in terms of how the message is delivered, because on the front end, I don't think professional social workers, county attorneys, and judges are making decisions about children's lives for financial gain. That is a very disturbing message to be given.
No, and any
while
talk
the
given,
social workers may be aware of the larger administrative issues, they are not using those larger administrative issues to make decisions on a case-by-case basis and a child-by-child case basis.
Right. No, I agree.
But the vast majority aren't. I mean, you're always going to have a bad actor in any system. There are bad actors in the education systems, right? In every organizations. But yes, I think the frontline workers generally want to do well. I think structurally, a lot of our child welfare systems need some serious reform, right? And that's an understated term, or like in terms of what needs to happen in terms of how many children are pulled into the system from poor families rather than the poor families getting the care that they need, right? And then I saw it when I was a frontline lawyer in the system, how much harm happens to those children in the system, right? Not from the families they're taken from, but from who are moved around and what happens to them. And the social workers change, like, because they have somebody at the CPS level, but then that stops once the child is in the system, and then they have a different social worker. And then once they shift over from reunification to long-term, different terminology, of whatever the agency uses, right? They shift social workers all the time. So they have no continuity of somebody working with them in the system. Same thing with their lawyers, right? Or the lawyers for the parents are changing all the time. So the children are just kind of shuffled through the system, and we're all just kind of part of the mechanism, and I think we have to look at ourselves in the mirror sometimes in terms of what we're doing.
Yeah, I think, Greg, if I can, and Greg, as you said, you were a child protection supervisor for 40 years, so you know that system. And I don't think I've ever run into, I think where the perverse incentive is on the end of when you take and you contract out this process to a third party that makes their income based on how many people they get on SSI. And this applies to, there are also revenue max things for people who are disabled to get them on SSI, homeless people. Then instead of saying, okay, there's 8% of fosters who have some revenue stream, all of a sudden they're talking about 20%, which seems to be an incentive to push kids into being on SSI who, aren't disabled, and then they get a label and they don't get the money anyway, So I think my experience, Greg, in doing this work at a state level is the contractor that is brought in to maximize revenue is where bad things happen, not at the social work level. The social workers have generally speaking, no idea of any.
The contractor and the leadership of the child welfare agency.
Of the agency,
yeah. As well, the business offices, the financial offices that's happening, or sometimes out of the governor's office, depends on how much they know. But you're right, like with the Rev Max, and it's not just Social Security benefits. I mean, 4E, that the administrative cost claiming is huge, right? Yeah. And the other incentive there, not only like the children are only eligible if they come from a poor family, right? And then the agency leadership, the revenue offices are trained often by these contractors, sometimes on their own, that they want to increase their penetration rate, is what they call it. What the penetration rate is, the percentage of children in foster care who come from poor families, who are 4E eligible. The higher the penetration rate, the higher administrative cost claiming they can have, the more money they can get. So those incentives are really concerning, at a structural level. Right.
But it also can have a good side. So I want to, play devil's advocate in respect. So I did this kind of work in Maryland as I've done, I confessed to Dan before the webinar started about my role in that. But what we did, and in those days, 4E was a much bigger revenue source than it is now percentage-wise. But basically, we had an agency that I thought had a lot of integrity at the secretary level to leadership level. And so what we did was basically, if kids were eligible for 4E and that had, no impact on anybody's decision-making about whether to get them in the system or not, we struck a deal with the state budget department that we would get to keep 50% of that money, and we plowed it into, one of the things we did was get a contract with the school social work at the University of Maryland, and we would pay social workers a year's tuition for every year they spent in child protection. We opened up, 6, 9, something like that, teen centers around the state for pregnant teens. We worked a deal where we just made sure that if a child was eligible, it's not that we're trying to only get kids into the system who were eligible, but if they were eligible for 4E, and none of that money would ever go to kids directly. So that wasn't a conflict. That we could use some of that money to improve services. So there are good versions of Revenue Max. And the other thing I was mentioning to Dan that we did along with 5 other states was to get the federal government to say that 50% of case management costs in child protection would be matched by the federal government. And so that has brought, just in the last few years, 100 million in new revenue into the state for child protection, and it's lowered caseloads across the state. So there are.
Is that in Maryland, Rich, or are you now talking about Minnesota?
I'm talking about Minnesota.
Gotcha.
We got the law passed that said that everybody has to use the same standards in screening child protection reports. that brought more kids into the system, but it actually brought in 100 million more of federal revenue.
Do you know with the federal match, is all of that going to the agency, or is a significant amount going to just the state fisc?
It goes to the counties and the state has to match it. So it actually brought caseloads down from, I'm told by the state, from an average of 19 per worker to an average of 12. About 400 more caseworkers got hired across the state. So just want to say revenue max isn't all evil. You know, there are ways to do it that actually benefit, you know, the direct service people and benefit the kids. But it's a leadership issue. As Dan says, you have to have leaders who are not perversely trying. You know, what's the point of maximizing revenue for child welfare if the revenue goes to the state? I mean, it's just not ethical.
Well, nonprofits have this potential conflict, right? Nonprofits need revenue, so they need to obtain revenue, maximize revenue. But the point is, they should be mission driven, you know, in that practice, and they should do it honestly and accurately, right? You know, in terms of the pursuit of revenue. And then when they get the revenue, they use it for that good mission in a true ethical way, right? Yeah. My concern is when a sleight of hand is happening, you know, there's a lot of illusory practices happening with Medicaid maximization around the country. But then even once they claim the federal match, the federal funds, a lot of those funds are then diverted to county or state general coffers rather than for the intended mission. Like, so keep your eye on the ball, you know, like be true, be accurate, and be ethical, right? It's really not complicated, but it's easy, I think, for organizations to lose sight on why they exist.
That's right. And I think, you know, you set up something with perverse incentives with the best of intentions, and then it works well, and you get a new leadership, and all of a sudden it doesn't work well because, you know, they get gold in their eyes. Well, time for maybe one more question. I'm sorry, I've tended to dominate it, but it was an interview. And thanks, Greg, for your thoughts on that. Anybody else have any input or questions? Well, it's a little bit of an obscure, you know, abstract kind of conversation, except an important one for those, you know, 800 or 900 kids a year, which hopefully will start getting some money in a trust fund to help them when they transition out of foster care. So, and then aspirationally, we've talked with foster advocates about this and others. Aspirationally, what we want to do is get this in place and say, hey, we ought to set aside X dollars for every child who has been at any point in the foster care system, not just kids who have their own revenue stream. So, you know, check in 4 years and see where we are on that, because it's going to take 3 years to get this one through.
Hopefully faster. I've been impressed with the efforts that you all have made, and I appreciate the chance to have this conversation, both with you, Rich, and everybody here. I mean, it can get kind of complex into the weeds of the issues in this particular issue, but it's so symbolic and important about the purpose of government, right? And the purpose, especially of those government agencies that serve the most vulnerable among us, to make sure we're true to mission.
Well, since we're trading compliments, I just want to say that one of the reasons it's taken us a year to get as far as we have to really get a bill is because of the pioneering work that you did in Maryland. It wouldn't have been possible. You paved the way. There's so many things that we didn't have to figure out from scratch because you had already done it. So, you know, thanks to you for all your work on this over the years as well.
Thank you.
Well, with that, I think we'll end. Thank you all so much for showing up, and we will see you in the fall. Just watch for the fall program once we cook it up, and we'll see you then.
Bye, everybody. Great talking.
Okay. Bye-bye. Let's see. I saw a chat there at the last second, but I lost it. Hold on. Bear with me. There it is. You're welcome, James, as well. And someone else said that. Amanda, thank you. All right, we'll see you in the fall.